Before city streets were paved in stone, before markets spilled over with voices and smells, before temples rose in tiered glory to honor the gods, rooftops had already been claimed, not by kings or scribes or masons, but by wings. There, above the noise, above the dust and commerce of ancient life, pigeons gathered. Silent, soft, persistent, living between the city's breath and the open sky. Their world was made of ledges and beams, of arches and alcoves, of warmth stored in brick, of breezes funneled between towers. They were not farmed, not tamed, not named, but they belonged, just as surely as water belonged to the river. Long before humans learned to build, pigeons lived in cliffs. They nested in the crevices of limestone, in sun-baked outcrops across North Africa, southern Europe, and the lands that would become Mesopotamia. Their feathers blended with stone. Their instincts were simple: return, nest, feed, repeat. But as people rose from wandering to dwelling, something curious happened. The shapes they made, of homes, temples, walls, began to resemble those ancient cliffs, vertical, staggered, full of edges and corners and hidden places. The pigeons noticed, and they moved in. The earliest known cities, Uruk, Eridu, Mari, were not quiet places. They hummed with ritual, with commerce, with labor. But even in their noise, the rooftops remained calm. There, pigeons cooed and circled, watching from above. They became the city's first residents who asked for nothing. No pay, no home, no voice in decisions. They only wanted height, a place to land, a memory to return to. And pigeons are, if nothing else, masters of memory. Their homing instinct is not myth. It is craft, it is wiring, it is knowing the shape of a place so deeply that no distance can erase it. They memorize the light off the ziggurat walls. They memorize the angle of the temple's shadow at noon. They memorize the scent of drying grain drifting from rooftops. They memorize the music of bells, the lift of wind between alleys, the vibration of morning prayers. And then, without fanfare, they made these cities their own. In Babylon, pigeons found rest among the glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate. Above the mythical beasts, lions and dragons, they perched, silent, invisible against blue tile. In Nineveh, their wings brushed the faces of stone kings, unmoved by their crowns. In Thebes, they nested in the folds of columns shaped like papyrus. When the Nile flooded, they flew inland. When it receded, they returned, and no one questioned their place. Children noticed them first. They fed them scraps, watched their heads bob, their wings flick, their eyes dart. Vendors noticed them too. They swept grain from the corners of baskets and watched the birds descend. Even priests, in their white robes, paused to watch a flock lift suddenly into the air, as if something unseen had given a signal. But the pigeons were not yet useful, not yet divine, not yet trained. They were simply present. And that was enough. They lived in the city like breaths in the body, without asking to be noticed, without demanding to be remembered. But the memory came anyway. In the earliest myths, doves and pigeons were not separate. They shared meanings: fertility, peace, the return of life after loss. And pigeons, soft-voiced and round-bodied, embodied these ideas. In Sumer, clay figurines shaped like birds have been found near temples. No names, no records, but someone made them. Someone shaped a bird in their palm and left it near the gods. In Akkad, tablets mention sacrifices of birds, not rare birds but local ones, perhaps pigeons, perhaps doves. Their blood was seen as cleansing, their flight as a kind of message. In Egypt, birds filled the margins of papyri and the surfaces of tomb walls. Geese, herons, cranes, but also pigeons. They were kept in dovecotes near temples, offered as food to the dead, raised for both their flesh and their feathers. Some scholars believe they were the first animals domesticated for meat, not labor. Not for wool, not for milk, but for sustenance alone. And yet, their lives were not only culinary. They were companions. In painted scenes from Beni Hassan, a man offers a pigeon on his arm as one would offer a falcon. There is ease in the gesture, familiarity. The pigeon is not restrained, not frightened, it is still. In India, pigeons appear in temple carvings from as early as 2000 BCE. Perched among the gods, unmoving among scenes of chaos and devotion, they were believed to carry the soul, to accompany prayers, to embody the part of us that leaves and comes home. And so they stayed, even when people forgot why. They nested in the ruins, in the broken roofs, in the silent courtyards. They saw cities fall and rise again. They flew over fires and over water and always over people. Their world was not linear. It was cyclical. They returned, always. In Jerusalem, pigeons still nest in the western wall. In Athens, they still glide from the Acropolis to the markets. In Rome, they still land on marble steps as they did when Caesar walked them. Their presence is so consistent, so quietly unbroken, that we forget they are history's witnesses, not in words, but in wings. They have seen more than we will ever write, heard more than we will ever say. They live in the silence above noise, in the air between bells, in the heat that rises from the roofs at noon. And perhaps this is why they matter. Not because they carried messages, though they did. Not because they fed armies, though they did that too. But because they remind us that cities are not just made of people. They are made of patterns, of returning, of breath. And pigeons are breath with wings. In the late afternoons of ancient cities, when the sun hung heavy over the rooftops, you could see them gather. On domes, on lintels, on statues. Their feathers fluffed, their eyes half-lidded. Their sounds low and constant, a murmur, a rhythm, the sound of the city exhaling. When night came, they did not scatter, they stayed. They roosted in alcoves carved for water jars, in holes left by scaffolds, in spaces no longer used. And as torches flickered below, they closed their eyes, not because they trusted, but because they knew. The city would still be there in the morning, and they would still belong to it. In the first light, before voices returned, before carts creaked, before bells rang, they flew. Not far, not high, just enough to stretch, to circle, to remember, to remind the city softly that it had always been alive, not just in its streets, but in its air. We rarely speak of them now. We call them pests, we shoo them, we ignore their nests, but the truth is they are still here, watching, returning, living above us. Not because we allow it, but because the city still resembles the cliffs and they still know the way home. There is a silence in the sky before a message arrives. Not a void, but a breath. A pause before the wind brings word. In the ancient world where messages moved by foot and sail, where secrets were carried in scrolls tied by string, there were wings that moved quicker than any rider. Not wings of myth or fire or God, but the soft, gray wings of a bird most never noticed. A bird already living on their rooftops. Already listening, already watching. This is the part of the story where the pigeon is no longer just a resident of the city. It becomes its voice. It begins perhaps in Egypt. The Egyptians were not only builders of pyramids and keepers of stars, they were lovers of precision. They measured time in shadow, they measured days in floods, and they measured trust in messages, sent and received. As early as 3000 BCE, they understood that distance could be conquered. Not by speed on land, but by flight through sky. Pigeons were raised in temple yards and palace gardens. Not for meat, though they provided it. Not for beauty, though they had it. But for messages. The earliest Egyptian pigeon keepers trained their birds not through force, but through familiarity. Pigeons returned to where they were born, always. If fed at a place, they remembered it. If treated gently, they stayed loyal. It did not take long to realize. If a pigeon is taken from its home and released elsewhere, it will fly back, straight, fast, unerringly. No winding road, no enemy checkpoint, no delay, it would return. And in its claw or tied to its leg it could carry a message, a scrap of papyrus, a mark, a prayer, a warning. And so the pigeon became more than background, it became a carrier. Pharaohs used them to communicate between temples, merchants used them along the Nile, even festivals were announced by bird. In Thebes, it is said, priests could signal sunrise rituals with birds, released at dawn, arriving at other temples before the light. But Egypt was only the beginning. To the east, in Persia, pigeons flew over the long, winding roads of the empire. The Persian royal road, stretching more than 500 miles from Susa to Sardis, was built for messengers. But it was pigeons that delivered the first alerts. The Achaemenid Empire, vast, ordered, elegant, needed speed. They built towers not just for flame but for wings. From station to station, pigeons were kept, fed, loved. They carried names, treaties, timetables, tales of revolt, and always they returned, even when taken hundreds of miles away, even when the weather changed, even when cities fell. A pigeon's loyalty is not to empire, it is to memory. In Greece, this knowledge became science. Greek philosophers admired the order of nature. They watched the skies as carefully as they watched the sea. And in pigeons, they saw a mystery worth mastering. Homer's epics do not mention pigeons by name. But his cities are filled with movement, and pigeons were always there. By the time of the classical period, the Greeks had begun using pigeons for military intelligence. In the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, it's said that birds were used to carry troop movements. One bird could change the course of a city's fate. And in Olympia, during the ancient Olympic Games, pigeons were released from the arena to announce the victors. They returned home with glory in their wings. But the most organized use of pigeons was yet to come. In the Roman Empire, pigeons became part of the postal system. Romans prized efficiency. They built roads, aqueducts, systems, and pigeons became one of them. From Gaul to Judea, from the hills of Britain to the sands of Egypt, pigeons flew with reports, with orders, with names of the fallen, with signs of peace. Roman generals stationed birds at camps. If a fortress was under siege, a pigeon could escape even when a messenger could not. They were small, quick, unstoppable. And when they returned, a scroll wrapped in thread around one leg, they landed not to applause but to hands trained to read in haste. This was not magic, this was design. The dovecotes of Rome were elaborate, wooden, clay, even carved into stone. Birds were raised in warmth, fed gently. Their wings never clipped, their rotes memorized. And when a war began, they were ready. It's said that during the siege of Modena, birds were used to communicate across enemy lines, dropping into the city under cover of dusk, bearing messages of hope or warning. In this way, pigeons were not only messengers, they were the thread that kept cities sewn together. But perhaps nowhere did the pigeon fly higher than in Baghdad. During the Abbasid Caliphate, the Islamic Golden Age flourished. Science, medicine, astronomy, poetry, all advanced in tandem. And among them, so too did the art of the pigeon post. Baghdad became the center of a network stretching across the empire. From Cairo to Damascus, from Samarkand to Mecca, messages were sent between scholars, judges, traders. A letter might take days by camel, but a pigeon could arrive before sunset. These birds flew above deserts, above politics, above borders, and they brought with them knowledge. In the House of Wisdom, where scholars translated ancient Greek into Arabic, pigeons delivered rare texts, corrections, new ideas. And when plague came, it was pigeons that warned the outer cities. Their messages were short, concise, but they saved lives. And always, they returned. By now, the pigeon was no longer just bird. It was institution. Homes built special ledges, markets traded in trained birds, breeding became art. Pigeon fanciers learned bloodlines, they tracked colors, speeds, distances, and yet even as the science grew, the wonder remained. To see a bird leave and know it would return was to believe in something constant. A world where memory overcame fear, where direction came not from sign but from instinct. And perhaps that's why pigeons became more than messengers. They became symbols of hope, of loyalty, of love that could cross miles, of connection that could not be broken. In China, pigeons were used for messages along trade routes. In India, they served sultans and maharajas. In Japan, temples kept them not only for peace but for protection. And always in every place they carried the cities within them, the scent of their home, the color of the light, the shape of the stones. We talk now of technology as the height of communication, satellites, fiber optics, code. But once a message arrived not with a ping but with the sound of wings, not with an alert but with a flutter. And someone reached out and gently took the note and read words that had flown over danger to reach them. That is trust. That is history. That is what pigeons carried and still carry. Even today, some are trained for sport, for love, for ceremony. They are released at weddings, at memorials, at festivals, and they return, not to their keeper, but to their memory. Because pigeons do not belong to us. They belong to place, to the alley where they first learned to fly, to the rooftop that fed them, to the smell of water drying in morning heat. They are messages in themselves, proof that return is possible, proof that loyalty is not myth. They carry cities in their wings, and sometimes if we're quiet, we can still hear the sky whispering. There are creatures that belong to the earth, there are creatures that belong to the water, and then there are those that seem to belong somewhere in between, part shadow, part air, part song. The pigeon, quiet and unassuming, once rose beyond the rooftops of cities to touch something deeper. Not just sky, but spirit. This is the chapter where pigeons become sacred, not by choice, not by force, but by the nature of their presence, always above, always near, always returning. Long before books were bound, long before temples had walls, birds carried meaning. They crossed boundaries, they flew over barriers, they disappeared into the distance and came back. People watched. They asked, where do they go? How do they know to return? What else might they carry? And in the spaces between those questions, myths began to form. Let us begin in Mesopotamia, where the ziggurats reached upward like staircases for the divine. The people of Sumer, and later Akkad and Babylon, believed that gods lived above, in realms where earth could not reach. To ascend, one needed offering. To connect, one needed sign. To understand, one needed symbols. Birds became those symbols. Among them, pigeons, small, ever-present, humble, became offerings to Inanna, the goddess of love and fertility. Clay tablets mention the sacrifice of white birds. Archaeologists believe these were doves and pigeons, interchangeable in language, but carefully chosen in purpose. They were soft. They were pure. They were already near the temples. To release one was not just ritual, it was sending something upward, a prayer, made feathered. Later, in Canaanite culture, pigeons were linked to Asherah, the great mother goddess, symbol of fertility and protector of life. Small bird figurines were buried beside homes, placed on altars, tucked in walls. They were not decoration, they were intercession. In Egypt, pigeons were among many sacred birds, though they lacked the grandeur of the ibis or the mystique of the falcon. Still, they were offered in tombs. They were fed near temples. They were drawn in quiet profile along the edges of scenes that celebrated life, death, and the passage between them. And in Greece, the connection grew stronger. The goddess Aphrodite, born of sea foam, emerged with pigeons in flight above her. They followed her chariot. They adorned her statues. They became symbols not only of love, but of transcendence. The Greeks saw pigeons not as messengers of mortals, but of emotion itself. The way they moved, soft-winged, circular, unhurried, mirrored affection, longing, connection. In temples to Aphrodite, pigeons were often present, not caged, not displayed, just nearby, as if even the divine needed company. This tradition echoed in Rome, where Venus, the Roman mirror of Aphrodite, was often depicted with pigeons at her feet or circling above. Romans, ever practical, also saw them as symbols of loyalty. Two pigeons sitting side by side became an emblem of marriage, of peace, of devotion. And when temples gave way to basilicas and emperors bowed to bishops, the pigeon remained. But now it took on a new form. In early Christianity, the dove, and by association the pigeon, became the image of the Holy Spirit. At the baptism of Christ, it is said, a dove descended from heaven, the sky opened, and the voice of God spoke. From that moment, the bird became a bridge between the divine and the human. In catacombs beneath Rome, where persecuted Christians prayed in secret, doves were carved into the walls, not for beauty, but for comfort. A reminder that flight was still possible, that return was promised, that spirit could rise. Throughout Christian art, the dove came to mean peace, grace, blessing. In weddings, doves are released. At funerals, they mark the soul's journey. But the tradition is older than scripture, older than translation. It is as old as watching a bird lift from a rooftop and disappear into golden light. And in Judaism too, pigeons and doves held meaning. In the Torah, they are offered in place of larger animals, especially for the poor who could not afford oxen or sheep. They are brought to the temple, laid on the altar, seen as sufficient. In the story of Noah, it is a dove that brings back the olive branch, a sign that the flood has passed, that the world is safe again. That message could have come through thunder, through flame, through dream. But it came through wings, small, gray, consistent. Because sacredness does not always wear grandeur, sometimes it wears feathers. In Islam, birds are part of creation's rhythm. The Quran speaks of all beings glorifying God, the birds in flight, the animals in herds, the humans in prayer. While pigeons are not singled out, they are present. In Mecca near the Grand Mosque, pigeons are protected. They are fed by pilgrims. They are allowed to nest freely, because to harm them is to disrupt something blessed. It is said that pigeons flew around the Prophet's resting place, and so to this day they are welcomed, honored, remembered. And in Hinduism, pigeons are seen as carriers of the soul. In some rituals, pigeons are released after a person's death, as a symbol of the Atman, the inner self, leaving the body and returning to the eternal. In temples, pigeons circle in flocks, their wings beating softly in the hot air. their coos echoing against stone. They are fed not for favor, but for dharma, for duty, for balance. Because the act of feeding is the act of remembering that life moves beyond the scene. And pigeons live in that beyond. In Buddhism too, birds symbolize the transition from ignorance to awakening, from fear to freedom. And though the pigeon is not as central as other birds, its presence in monasteries, in mountain temples, is steady. It lives in the courtyards, on the tiles, in the hollows of bells. Its rhythm is not loud, it is felt. A coo before sunrise, a flutter during meditation, a feather drifting through incense. It reminds without interrupting. That is the nature of the sacred. It arrives without asking, it stays without claim, it leaves without demand, and always it returns. We sometimes forget that pigeons are wild. Because they live among us, we assume they are ours. But their sacredness does not come from being kept. It comes from being constant. They do not flee when cities change. They do not vanish when walls crumble. They stay. And in that staying, they become something holy, not through power, but through presence. Today we see pigeons on statues. We grumble when they gather. We call them ordinary. But the statues they land on once honored gods. The temples they roost in once heard prayers. And they remember. More than we do. They remember the songs sung at dawn. They remember the smells of ritual food. They remember the hands that fed them, not out of habit, but out of hope. They remember being part of something larger, something that did not need to be named. So perhaps when we see a pigeon circling a tower, or sitting alone in an empty courtyard, or lifting into the air at sunset, we might pause, not to revere, not to fear, but to recall that once before we built cathedrals of glass, before we lit cities with wires, before we wrote words to define what is holy, a pigeon was enough. A soft wing, a quiet eye, a return, and still, they return. Every city has a sound, not the noise of its markets or the clang of its gates, but a quieter rhythm, soft and steady, like breath. In the ancient world, that rhythm often lived in the spaces between structures, in courtyards, on terraces, along staircases carved into sun-warmed walls. And in those spaces there were pigeons. They were not symbols here, not sacred messengers or imperial couriers. Here they were neighbors. This is the chapter of everyday life. Of grain spilled from baskets, of cooing at sunrise, of fluttering shadows across walls cracked by heat. It begins in the most human place of all, the home. In ancient Mesopotamia, homes were built close together, their rooftops flat, joined like puzzle pieces. Courtyards were open to the sky. Kitchens stood without ceilings. Children played in the light. Dogs napped in corners. And pigeons, dozens of them, roosted in the beams, in niches near the stairways, sometimes even inside the home. They were never fully tame. They were not pets, but they were familiar. They returned to the same ledges. They came when the lentil pot boiled. They waited for hands to brush crumbs from the table. Some families kept shallow trays filled with water on the roofs, not as offerings, just as kindness. Others left old bowls near the cooking fire, where pigeons pecked at the husks of barley or the brittle edge of flatbread. They were part of the routine. In early Egyptian villages, evidence suggests people intentionally built nesting niches into walls. Stacks of small, rounded hollows shaped in mud brick offered ideal shelter. At first, it may have been accidental, a place where pigeons settled, a corner warmed by the sun, but slowly patterns formed. These pigeon towers, or dovecotes, began to appear not only in rural homes but in the courtyards of wealthier households. They weren't ornamental. They were practical. Pigeons provided meat. Their droppings, rich in nitrogen, became fertilizer. Their feathers were used to stuff cushions or insulate walls. And still, they remained free. No cages, no leashes. Just the agreement between memory and place. In Greece, small families in hillside villages often built their homes with open rooftops, where fig trees and drying herbs lived in clay pots. Here, pigeons nested near the chimneys. They flew over olive groves. They returned at dusk. Children fed them as naturally as they fed the goats. A handful of grain, a crust of bread. In painted vases, birds are often seen near women gathering fruit or drawing water, unremarkable, uncounted, yet always there. In Rome, pigeon towers became more refined. Especially in country villas, dovecotes were built with geometric symmetry. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of square holes arranged in walls like honeycomb. Inside, birds bred, returned. A family might collect the eggs for food or leave them to hatch. Young boys might gather feathers after molting season. but rarely did anyone disturb the birds. Because pigeons did not require training. They required respect. They found the rhythm of a household. They adapted to it. They added to it. In the mornings they cooed before the roosters. At noon they rested in shadows. At dusk they filled the sky with a slow drifting motion, not in flocks, but in memory. Each pigeon returned to its own corner, its own notch, its own stone. And in doing so it reminded the city, home is not marked by walls, but by return. In Persia, the practice of pigeon keeping reached an artful peak. Pigeon towers, massive rounded structures, were built from mud brick and lime. Some were tall as trees, cylindrical and elegant. Inside, hundreds of birds nested. The guano collected below was harvested not just for agriculture, but for tanning leather and making gunpowder. But these towers were more than functional. Their designs were beautiful. Patterns carved into the walls, openings shaped like flowers, roofs built to cool in summer. People spoke of their pigeons by name. They knew their flight times. They read the sky not by stars, but by wings. In cities like Isfahan, these towers dotted the landscape, each one alive with soft motion. In India, especially in Rajasthan and Gujarat, pigeons were part of family life. Some temples set aside seed for them daily. Children, after morning prayers, scattered grain along the walkways. In busy markets, pigeons fluttered among the stalls, never startled, never chased. They knew which vendor left rice unguarded, which baker's roof offered warmth, and in narrow homes they perched on windowsills like old friends who needed no introduction. Even in urban palaces, pigeons found space. Among the lattices, under the domes, beside the fountains. They made themselves small. They learned not to interrupt. And the people, in turn, learned to live with them. They were not pets. They were not pests. They were part of the house. In China, pigeons lived in alleys and courtyards alike. Some were trained to fly with bamboo whistles tied to their tails. As they soared, the wind played a gentle tune, a sound like breathing, like memory. In Beijing, old Hutong neighborhoods still recall the days when pigeon songs drifted across tiled roofs at dusk. It was not music made for show. It was music made for home. Because pigeons knew the rooftops like maps. They knew where incense curled upward. They knew where hot oil sizzled. They knew where water pooled after rain. They did not wander far. They stayed close. They observed, and in their observation, they became a kind of witness. To the child's first steps, to the grandmother's morning prayer, to the spilled rice swept gently from the floor. They knew the rhythm of laundry hung at noon, the scent of soup rising from open pots, the taste of seeds stored for winter. They lived not in the city's history, but in its habit. And habit is where memory becomes muscle. In some homes, pigeons were believed to bring luck. In others, they were simply accepted. Feathered neighbors, asking nothing, offering presents. Even when they dirtied ledges or nested too near the door, rarely were they harmed, because something in their eyes reminded people that they, too, had returned. That they, too, sought shelter, warmth, routine. In ancient cities, architecture was built to serve the living, and pigeons, by simply being there, became part of the design. Not forced, not planned, but integrated. Their shadows flickered across courtyard walls. Their feathers drifted into fountains. Their cooing wove into the music of vendors, bells, footsteps. They were texture. They were part of what made a place feel inhabited. Even in ruins today, the pigeons come back. In the crumbled edges of Pompeii, in the silent halls of Persepolis, in the columns of forgotten shrines, they perch, they nest, they wait, not because they are nostalgic, but because they remember structure. They remember return. They teach, quietly, that life happens in repetition, in small spaces, in shared quiet. That sacredness does not only live in temples but also in terraces, not only in ritual but in routine, not only in flight but in staying. And so, when you next hear a pigeon outside your window, or see one bathing in the curbside puddle, or watch it land precisely on a narrow ledge, perhaps see not intrusion but continuation. Not interruption, but evidence. That your home, too, is remembered. That somewhere, a soft-winged neighbor knows the turn of your key, the warmth of your windowsill, the shape of your roofline at dusk. That you are part of the city's breath, and they are part of yours. There are certain things in cities that disappear without warning. A familiar scent that fades with the season. A familiar face that no longer walks the same route. A building torn down before anyone thought to remember its windows. the rhythm of footsteps that once echoed through a certain courtyard. But not everything vanishes. Some things return again and again, like tides, like songs. Pigeons are one of those things. They do not need invitation. They do not announce their arrival. They simply appear on rooftops, in squares, on ledges warmed by centuries of sun. This is the end of their story, and yet it is also its beginning, because pigeons do not live in straight lines. They live in circles, in cycles, in the act of coming back. This final chapter is not about history. It is about what remains, about the quiet companions we forgot were watching. Let us begin not in the past, but in the present. In the city as it is now, restless, vertical, glowing. There are taxis, buses, screens. There are doors that slide open without touch. There are voices that come through satellites and speakers. Everything is fast, everything moves. And yet, above it all, on the ridges of concrete, on the eaves of glass towers, pigeons perch. They are not part of the plan. They were not drawn on the architect's blueprint. But they arrive anyway. They find the familiar shape, a narrow ledge, a warm surface, a corner with just enough space. They read the angles of our buildings like old maps, because they've seen them before. Not these towers exactly, but these proportions, these patterns. The ancient city was not so different. It had plazas too. It had walls and arches. It had corners where light fell at the same angle each morning. It had people who opened doors and tossed scraps without thinking. And pigeons were there, silent nearby, remembering. Now, in the modern city, they still return. In Paris, they gather under wrought iron balconies. In Cairo, they nest between satellite dishes. In Tokyo, they circle over vending machines and neon lights. In Lima, they sit quietly on colonial statues, watching tourists lean in for photos. No matter how many centuries have passed, how many empires have risen and fallen, how many religions and languages have layered over stone, the pigeons remain. Not because they are stubborn, but because they are tuned to the deep pulse of place, to the echo between towers. That echo is not sound but memory. It is the way stone cools at night, the way air moves between buildings, the way people return to the same spot again and again without knowing why. Pigeons feel it. They navigate by it. Not just with their senses, magnetic fields, sun position, scent trails, but with something else, something slower, something older, something like instinct refined over thousands of years. They remember more than routes. They remember rhythm. There are countless stories, rarely written down, of pigeons returning to ruins, not cities but what's left of them. A set of columns, a broken aqueduct, a temple with no roof. They fly over what once was, and they land as if it never left. Archaeologists have seen them before excavations. Locals point them out without thinking. Of course they come here, they say, because pigeons know. They return to the last place that felt like home, and they wait. Not for us. Not for recognition, just for the pattern to return. And sometimes it does. A new wall built over old brick, a new bakery where the old one burned, a new child tossing crumbs on the same stoop his grandmother once swept. The pigeons watch. They do not smile. They do not cheer. But they stay. And in staying, they remind us that some parts of a city are carried not by stone, but by habit, by touch, by quiet. In ancient cities, pigeons were part of that quiet. They lived in the pauses, between footsteps, between the call to prayer and the closing of the gate, between the sweep of a broom and the placing of water jars. Now they still live in the pauses, between buses passing, between phones ringing, between the final elevator chime and the locking of a door. They perch in places we do not think to look, but places that matter. Because a city is not defined by its tallest tower. It is defined by its shadows, by the warmth of its windows, by the softness of its margins, and pigeons live in those margins. We often call them nuisances now. They cluster too thickly. They scatter too suddenly. They make messes. But perhaps we forget that the mess is not theirs alone. It is shared. We've built cities without thinking of return, without remembering the rhythms that made them feel alive. We favored speed over stillness, distance over closeness, noise over murmur. But the pigeons did not change. They continued. They remained. They live in places that still echo. That echo may be faint, it may be buried under engines and alarms, but it's there, and pigeons find it. That is why, in every city there is a moment, small, nearly invisible, when you pause at a crosswalk, and a pigeon walks alongside you. It is not afraid, It is not in a hurry. It is matching your pace, not to imitate, but to remind. That once in a city not so different from this one, someone else walked there. Someone else paused. And a pigeon walked beside them too. These birds are not merely survivors, they are rememberers. They remember cities that no longer exist, not as maps, but as feelings. They remember the smell of steam from kitchens, the slow sweep of aprons against stone, the way light fell at noon on a certain courtyard. And when they pass that spot again, even if the walls are gone, they circle. Because memory has no need for perfection, only for direction. And pigeons follow memory. There are places in the world where cities have vanished, swallowed by jungle, by sand, by silence. And yet, the pigeons are still there. Roosting in broken temples, flying between empty towers, landing on steps that now lead nowhere. They do not grieve, but they do not forget. Because forgetting is the luxury of those who leave. Those who stay must remember. And pigeons stay. In their staying they carry a kind of grace. They do not demand food. They do not build monuments. They do not rewrite history. They simply live inside it. And sometimes that is enough. When we speak of ancient cities, we speak of their architecture, their trade routes, their wars. We rarely speak of the living texture, of who woke first, of what sound opened the day, of who fed the pigeons. But that texture is what gave the city its soul. And pigeons remember that soul. They remember the motion of humanity. Not the noise, but the gesture. The open palm, the shared shade, the resting gaze. They watched us then, they watch us now. Still they return to the same cornices, the same gutters, the same faces that never turn fully away. Because pigeons do not ask for attention, they ask for continuity. They ask for the right to belong without being noticed. And in return, they notice everything. Their eyes have seen sunrises over cities that no longer speak their own names. They've seen temples turn to houses, houses turn to shops, shops turn to ruins. And still, they remember the smell of warm bread, the flutter of curtains, the song someone once hummed by an open window. They do not mourn the city's changes. They fold into them. A nest in an air conditioning unit, a perch above a neon sign, a brief bath in the puddle near a subway vent. Still, they thrive, because they carry the ancient city within them, not in feathers, but in rhythm. They are the guardians of the unspoken. And perhaps, they are the last citizens who never left. When you close your eyes tonight, when the noise of your day quiets, when the ceiling above you feels still, imagine them there, not in flocks, not in flight, but waiting, perched gently, breathing slowly, guarding the rooftops with nothing but memory. They do not sing, they do not shine, but they remember for us, because we forget, so easily, so quickly. But pigeons do not. They return, again and again and again, to the echoes between towers, to the city before it woke. To the people before they were busy, to the stillness we once knew, and in their return they remind us who we were, and who we still might be, if only we too could learn to stay.